So in the last video, we introduced the idea of the political theme to our course. And I'd like to say right off the bat that the political theme, I think, is a little overblown. I think too much of history is kind of tied towards this political lens. So unfortunately, a lot of the course is kind of tied into or looks through this political lens. And so that's kind of a shame because I think the other themes, like the social theme or the economic theme, are just as important and sometimes more important, but they don't get as much attention as I think the political theme does. So, with that said, let's talk about Persia, because Persia does a really awesome job of creating empire without making everybody angry. So let's look at Persian government. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at one of the empires of Persia. So there are a long series of Persian empires or Persian governments. We're going to look at the first one because everybody basically just copied these guys after them. So what we're going to look at here is a Persian empire called the Achaemenid Empire. The Achaemenid Empire. So the Achaemenid Empire is founded in 558 BCE. So roughly about 2,500 years ago. The guy that founded this empire was known as Cyrus the Achaemenid. And if you're curious as to what an Achaemenid is, it's just somebody from Achaemia. That's it. Just someone from Achaemia, which was a part of Mesopotamia. So this is just Cyrus from Achaemia, and he's known as Cyrus the Achaemenid. That's all that means. And so he goes and he conquers a lot of other peoples in Southwest Asia, in Mesopotamia. So he's kind of creating an empire the same way that Sargon of Akkad did in our previous video. So he conquers a lot of other peoples in Southwest Asia. We're kind of thinking about what is kind of in modern Iran and Iraq. That's kind of where we're thinking about right now. Cyrus's son would go on to conquer more territory. Places like Turkey and the rest of Mesopotamia. But the guy that we really want to focus in on, also Egypt, that's probably important there too. The guy that we want to focus in on is Cyrus's grandson, and his name was Darius. I've also heard it pronounced Darius. I'm just going to call him Darius because that's what it looks like. So Darius manages to kind of control and unite all this territory. Kind of going from Egypt all the way over to essentially Iran, which is a pretty big piece of territory. This was the largest empire seen on Earth at the time. Now, Darius was a good military leader, but that's not what he's famous for. Darius is much more important for his administrative techniques. So yes, Darius did win battles and all of that kind of stuff, but he's much more important for us when we think about the stuff he did to govern his territory. So how did he govern all of these different peoples in this giant territory without there constantly being rebellions? So one of the things that he did was that he divided his territory into 23 districts. The name of which, it's not really that important, but we call them satrapies, or I guess he called them satrapies. Now, the satrapies were essentially the places where these different peoples lived. So each of these 23 districts was essentially the homeland of a group of people. So these were the homelands of different peoples that Darius ruled. So he's kind of letting these people govern themselves. There was a governor of the satrapy, which for our purposes was called a satrap. The governor himself was a Persian that Darius appointed. So this was someone that Darius knew and Darius trusted. But all the other government officials were local people. People that the local people knew. So think about it like this. We have a governor in our state, but how often do you ever deal with the governor himself? Hardly ever. But how often do you deal with your local officials, like your local county commissioners or your local school board members? You deal with them pretty frequently. And if they're people you know, if they're people you trust, you're more likely to trust in the government itself. So you will trust all the local officials because they're like you. They're from where you live. They speak the language you speak. They eat the same food you eat. They're just like you. So yeah, the governor at the very top was a Persian that was appointed by Darius, but all the local guys were people that you would know, that you would trust. And so in that sense, that keeps people from rebelling. Darius also, just as a check on this, he used spies to make sure his governors and other officials were loyal, and these people reported right to Darius. So yes, he did trust the satraps, but he's also making sure that they're not getting any ideas in their head. There were a lot of other administrative techniques that Darius used to make people maybe not happy, but not unhappy enough that they want to rebel. So here's a thing that Darius did. He used regular taxes. Now, nobody likes to pay taxes, but what Darius did was say the taxes will be collected at the same time every year, and for regular amounts. So yeah, you don't like paying taxes, but if you know how much the taxes are, if there's a regular amount that you have to pay, and you know when you have to pay them every year, you probably won't be as upset as if the taxes are unpredictable. Taxes are necessary. They pay for things that everybody likes to use. So nobody likes to pay taxes, but we all benefit from them, and people will be less angry about paying them if they know how much they have to pay in advance and when they have to pay them. Darius also built, using these taxes, he built a lot of roads, which are good for trade. People really aren't traveling, but merchants are traveling around trading stuff. He also built a lot of post offices, which allowed for easier communication. The most famous of these roads in the Persian Empire was the Royal Road. So this was essentially a highway. This was a very well-maintained road that Darius's officials had priority to use. So if there was a message that needed to be gotten somewhere very quickly, they would use the Royal Road. These public works projects, so that's what these are, public works, have a variety of benefits for a government. They keep people busy. They keep people busy so they don't have time to think about rebelling. They put money into people's pockets. Remember, hungry people rebel. And if people always have money in their pockets, they always will have food to eat. And the stuff that's produced, like roads and irrigation systems and post offices, keep people happy. So, yeah, nobody likes to pay taxes and nobody likes to be forced to build roads, but in the end, everybody benefits from this. So, yeah, an individual person might be angry, but generally speaking, the people themselves are pretty okay living in Persia. There's another technique that Darius used, and that was, as we mentioned in the previous video, there was a connection to religion. Now, this is kind of complicated. One of the techniques that Darius used was that he allowed for religious freedom. He allowed for religious freedom. It didn't really matter to Darius what religion you practiced. In fact, if you have religious freedom, that prevents rebellions. People are very connected to their religions, and if you force them to practice a religion they don't want to, that can cause a rebellion. So what Darius did was say, practice whatever religion you want. I don't particularly care. I have my religion, but it doesn't really matter if you practice yours. Darius was a Zoroastrian, which is kind of a contemporary religion to Judaism. And we'll talk more about these religions in our unit on religion. But Zoroastrianism and Judaism kind of arise around the same time, and they are both kind of unique in that they are both monotheistic religions. They are both monotheistic religions. And so what Darius did was, at the same time as saying that everyone was allowed to practice their own religion, Darius said, I myself am a Zoroastrian, and the Zoroastrian god, Ahura Mazda, allows me, Darius, to rule and rule over you. And so the idea here is that while Ahura Mazda may not be my god, the fact that Ahura Mazda is a god and likes Darius means that he's probably okay. So even though Darius wasn't forcing religious change, it's a good sign that a god approves of him. And maybe you might want to join his religion too. He's not forcing it, but you might want to join his religion too. So while this isn't perfect, Darius and the Persians manage to keep people happy enough to stay in power for centuries. Darius manages to keep people just happy enough to stay in power for centuries, and they would have stayed in power for longer, but they came up against Alexander the Great, who kind of wipes them out. So Alexander comes in and kind of takes over the Achaemenid Empire. But Darius's techniques live on. In fact, a lot of the stuff that we just went over here, empires still use today. I mean, the fact that the United States is kind of built into districts is evidence that this works. So what Darius did was figure out a way to have a big empire with lots of people in it and keep those people relatively happy through a series of public works projects, the incorporation of local government, and religious freedom. All these things are designed to do is to keep people happy. So if you take one message away from this stuff about empire, it's that empires who can keep their people happy will last longer than those who can't. All right, so that is it on the idea of government and the government of Persia. Remember, the government of Persia is so important mostly because everybody else in the world is going to copy what they did. And they did it first, and they did it pretty well. So this is Mr. Nissen signing off.